Ghosting a failure is just good business, my father announced into his champagne flute, toasted by a table of socialites who had once known my name. Behind him, the oversized family Christmas card was projected on the ballroom screen. A perfect portrait where I had been seamlessly photoshopped out and replaced by the family's new golden retriever. He didn't just erase my presence. He mocked my absence, calling it a necessary pruning of the family tree. As the room erupted in polite laughter, I didn't make a scene. I stood in the shadows of the balcony, watched my mother nod in silent agreement, and walked out into the night without a single goodbye. Before I tell you about the accidental social media post that turned me from a pruned branch into the only lifeboat my family has left, tell me in the comments, have you ever been the invisible child until you became the successful one? I'm reading every single story. 7 years later, I sat in the glass-walled office of my firm in Palo Alto, a world away from the toxic ballrooms of my youth. In front of me wasn't a ruined passbook, but a viral Instagram notification that was currently shattering the quiet life I'd built. My Uncle Richard, the only family member too oblivious to follow the no Chloe rule, had posted a selfie from the Mediterranean. In the background sat a sleek $15 million carbon fiber yacht. His caption read, "Living large in Monaco. Can't believe my niece Chloe owns this beast. Proud uncle." He had tagged my private account. The ghost was officially out of the machine. I'm Chloe, and at 30 I've spent the last 7 years perfecting the art of being a non-person. As a software CEO, I know how to build systems that run in the dark. I know how to keep secrets behind layers of encryption. But looking at my phone, I felt the digital walls crumbling. The first text arrived less than 3 minutes after the post went live. It was from Naomi, the mother who hadn't sent so much as a happy birthday in nearly a decade. "Chloe, sweetie. We saw Richard's post. We've been so worried about you. Dad is actually quite sick. It's his heart and a little legal trouble. We need a family reunion immediately. Call me back, we miss you so much." I stared at the screen as it lit up with more notifications. Leonard, my brother, family friends who had blocked me years ago. They didn't see a daughter or a sister. They saw a home made of money. I looked out at the Pacific, my fingers hovering over the block button, but then I stopped. A different plan was formed. A gift for my family that would look exactly like the bailout they were praying for, but would feel exactly like the justice they deserved. I picked up the phone and started typing. The algorithm didn't care about 7 years of silence. It only cared about engagement. I watched from my office in Palo Alto as the notification counter on my private Instagram account began to climb with a frantic, relentless energy. It started with a handful of likes, then dozens, then hundreds of shares. The source of the digital wildfire was a single blurry selfie posted by my Uncle Richard. Richard had always been the family's oblivious outlier, the only one too disorganized to remember that I had been officially unpersoned. In the photo, he was grinning like a schoolboy, his skin flushed pink from the Mediterranean sun. But it wasn't his face that was causing the stir. It was the background. Towering over the dock in Monaco was the Aegis, my 60-meter carbon fiber custom yacht. It was a masterpiece of naval engineering, sleek and silent, a physical manifestation of the wealth I had built while my family was busy deleting me from their history. Living large in Monaco. Can't believe my niece Chloe owns this beast. Proud uncle. He had tagged me. Not the ghost they wanted me to be, but the woman I had become. The Chloe he tagged wasn't the daughter who had been pruned for refusing to bankroll her father's bad bets. She wasn't the girl who had been photoshopped out of the Christmas cards. She was a tech mogul with a valuation that could buy and sell the Cross family estate 10 times over. I watched as the comments section turned into a feeding frenzy. Most were strangers, but then the names started to change. Names I hadn't seen on my screen since I walked out of that ballroom 7 years ago. The ghost was officially back in the machine, and the digital walls I'd built to protect my peace were being torn down by the very people who had once claimed I didn't exist. Richard's accidental tag had done more than reveal my location. It had signaled to the vultures that the failure they discarded was now a trophy worth hunting. As the post hit 10,000 likes, I realized the invisibility I had traded for success was gone. The hunt had begun, and the first arrow was already in the air. The vibration of my phone against the mahogany desk felt like a tremor from a past life. I didn't need to check the contact name to know who it was. The area code alone was a ghost I had spent 7 years exorcising. It had been exactly 2,555 days since Naomi Cross last spoke to me, the night she told me that my selfishness was a cancer on the family. Now her number sat on my screen, glowing with a sudden parasitic warmth. "Hey sweetie, we missed you so much," the message began. The sweetie felt like a serrated blade. There was no acknowledgement of the nearly 3,000 days of radio silence, no apology for the Christmas cards where I was replaced by a dog, and no mention of the business decision to erase me. "Dad is actually quite sick. It's his heart," the next bubble read, followed immediately by a third that dropped the facade. "And to be honest, he's in some terrible legal trouble with the estate. We're all in such a state." We saw Richard's post. "You look so successful, Chloe. We need a family reunion immediately. We need our girl back." I leaned back in my chair, the Pacific breeze through the window cooling the sudden heat in my face. It was a masterpiece of manipulative framing. My father, Leonard, wasn't sick with a physical ailment. He was sick with debt. The heart she referred to was likely the crumbling core of his fraudulent real estate empire. They didn't miss their daughter. They missed the liquidity they had just discovered was sitting in a harbor in Monaco. I thought about the 2,555 days of silence. I thought about the trauma nurse I used to be, fading into the background of emergency rooms while I built my company in the dead of night, knowing I had no safety net because my parents had cut it out from under me. I was 30 now, a mogul in a world they couldn't even map, and yet Naomi still thought she could summon me with the same hollow sweetie she used when I was 10. The invisible child was gone. In her place was a woman who knew exactly how to read a balance sheet, and a betrayal. I didn't reply immediately. I let the read receipt sit there, a small digital torture for a woman who was likely counting the seconds until her lifeboat responded. I wasn't going to be their rescue. I was going to be their reckoning. I didn't call Naomi back. Instead, I called a man who specialized in unearthing the things people tried to bury under layers of prestige. If I was going to step back into the Cross family circus, I wasn't going as a daughter. I was going as a forensic architect of their destruction. I hired a private investigator to perform what I called an audit of souls. A deep dive into the financial rot that I knew was festering beneath my father's polished exterior. The report arrived 48 hours later, a digital dossier of desperation. As I scrolled through the pages, the reality was even grimmer than I had imagined. The luxury lifestyle my family flaunted on social media, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, the summer rentals, was a house of cards held together by the static of a dozen maxed-out credit cards. But the debt wasn't the headline. The real sickness was the embezzlement. Leonard hadn't just made bad investments. He had been raiding the family's remaining trust accounts to cover his shortfalls. He had spent 7 years moving the same $50,000 between shell accounts to simulate liquidity, all while the foreclosure proceedings on the Newport mansion were quietly gathering steam in the background. He was a drowning man who had been using my disappearance as a convenient tax shield, claiming me as a dependent for years to dodge the IRS while treating me like a ghost in his personal life. I realized then that Naomi's text wasn't a reach for connection. It was a frantic attempt to find a new source of capital before the federal auditors knocked on their door. I wasn't a person to them. I was a $15 million asset they had accidentally rediscovered on Uncle Richard's feed. Looking at the numbers, the lingering hope I had for a mother's love finally turned to ice. They had spent 7 years pretending I didn't exist while using my name to break the law. My father's heart condition was the fear of a prison cell. I closed the laptop, the blue light reflecting in my eyes like a cold fire. I knew exactly what they were hunting for and I was going to give it to them, but the price of my help was going to be their total unraveling. I waited 3 days to reply. I wanted the silence to echo in their empty bank accounts, to let the panic ripen until they were ready to agree to anything. When I finally sent the text, it was brief, professional, and devoid of the sweetie Naomi had tried to bait me with. "I'm in the Mediterranean for business," I wrote. "If you want to talk about estate issues, you can meet me in Antibes on Thursday. I'll have a car pick you up from the airport. Don't bring luggage. This is a day trip." The response was instantaneous, a flurry of heart emojis and thank gods that made my skin crawl. They didn't care that I was treating them like low-level vendors. They only cared that the vault door was finally creaking open. I spent the next 48 hours preparing my turf. This wouldn't be a meeting in a sterile office or a crowded restaurant. I wanted them on the water. I wanted them in the middle of the ocean, where the horizon was wide and there was nowhere to run when the truth came out. I instructed my crew on the Aegis to prepare the aft deck for a formal lunch. I wanted the full display of my mogul life. The white glove service, the shimmering teak, the sheer crushing scale of a ship that cost more than their entire Newport neighborhood. I sat on the deck as the tender brought them in from the pier. Through my binoculars I watched them. Leonard was already adjusting his blazer, trying to summon that old arrogant posture of a man in charge. Naomi was clutching her designer handbag, a knockoff according to my PI's report, and staring at the yacht with a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. Even from a distance I could see they weren't coming for a daughter. They were coming for a payday. As they stepped onto the swim platform, Leonard looked up, squinting against the sun. He didn't see the girl he'd photoshopped out of his life. He saw a solution to his crimes. "Chloe," he shouted, his voice booming with a fake, practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Look at this place. I always knew you had the Mercer drive." I stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in a sharp, clinical white suit that felt like armor. I didn't smile. I didn't reach out to hug them. I simply checked my watch. "You're 5 minutes late," I said, my voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "Let's get to work." My brother Julian followed our parents onto the deck with a swagger that was entirely unearned. At 26 he was still dressed in the uniform of the Newport elite, a pastel polo and loafers with no socks, but the fabric was fraying at the cuffs, and his eyes lacked the spark of a man with a future. He had been the golden child the night I was erased, the one my father promised would inherit the cross legacy while I was cast out for my disobedience. Now seeing him against the backdrop of my reality, I realized he wasn't gold at all. He was lead weight. "Nice boat, Chloe," he said, his voice thick with a mix of awe and immediate entitlement. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the 7-year gap. He simply walked over to the wet bar and began inspecting the labels of my vintage scotch. "A bit flashy for a tech nerd, isn't it? Dad said you were probably struggling in some studio apartment." "I own the building that studio apartment would be in, Julian," I said, my voice flat. I watched him pour a drink he couldn't afford, his hands slightly trembling. My PI's report had been clear. Julian hadn't held a job in 3 years. He was the primary beneficiary of my father's embezzlement, his lifestyle funded by the very fraud that was now drowning the family. He was a parasite who had never been taught how to hunt, only how to wait for the host to provide. "We should talk about the expansion," Julian continued, gesturing vaguely at the horizon. "Dad thinks with your backing we can pivot the real estate firm into tech-integrated properties. I'd be the perfect face for the project." The delusion was breathtaking. He actually believed this was a family merger rather than an autopsy. He looked at me and saw a bank, not a sister. He was so convinced of his own value that he couldn't see the handcuffs waiting on the shore. He was the weight that would pull Leonard and Naomi down faster than any debt, and he was too arrogant to even realize he was sinking. "The only thing you're going to be the face of, Julian, is the truth," I said, catching Naomi's sharp intake of breath. I signaled to the steward to bring out the blue folder, the one that contained the joint venture agreement. The air on the deck suddenly felt very thin. The transition from the tender to the deck of the Aegis was a study in naked avarice. As my parents and Julian stepped onto the polished teak, they didn't offer a hug or even a lingering look at my face to see how 7 years had changed me. Their eyes were locked on the hardware. Naomi's hand trailed over the custom stainless steel railings, her fingers twitching as if she were mentally appraising the scrap value. Leonard stood at the center of the aft deck, his chest puffed out, already assuming the posture of a man who had just inherited a fleet. "6 cabins, Chloe? Or is it 8? Leonard asked, his voice booming with a proprietary tone that set my teeth on edge. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was calculating the guest list for the investors he needed to impress to keep his head above water. "It's not about the cabins, Leonard," I said, purposely omitting the word, Dad. The syllable felt like ash in my mouth. Julian had already bypassed the greetings entirely. I watched him through the glass partition of the main salon. He was wandering through the staterooms, bouncing on the Italian leather sofas and checking the brand of the entertainment system. He wasn't a brother visiting a sister. He was a tenant-in-waiting, measuring the square footage for his own ego. To them, I was merely the inconvenient lock on a door that led to their salvation. "We'll need the master suite for the weekend of the regatta," Naomi remarked, adjusting her sunglasses as she scanned the horizon. It's the best way to show the bank that we've stabilized. Appearances are everything, you know. The air on the deck was thick with the scent of salt and the heavy, suffocating perfume of their entitlement. They were already moving the furniture in their minds, colonizing my sanctuary before the engines had even cooled. They saw a floating ATM, a $15 million band-aid for a $20 million hemorrhage. I signaled for the steward to bring out the chilled water and the leather-bound folder. Sit down, I said, the command cutting through Julian's loud laughter from the cabin. You didn't come here to measure the rooms. You came here because you're drowning. Let's talk about the weight that's pulling you under. The Mediterranean sun was blinding, reflecting off the white carbon fiber deck with a clinical brilliance. I sat perfectly still as the steward placed a leather-bound folder on the table between us. The salt air felt heavy, charged with the static of Leonard's desperation. He was vibrating with an energy I recognized, the frantic, sweating hustle of a gambler who had finally seen a royal flush. I've spent the last few days looking into your situation, Leonard, I said, my voice as cool as the chilled water in my glass. I know about the shortfalls. I know the banks are tightening the leash. I'm willing to step in, but I don't do charity. I do business. I slid the document across the teak table. The header, printed in a bold, authoritative serif, read, Joint Venture Agreement, Cross Properties and Aegis Holdings. It's a partnership, I explained, watching his eyes dart toward the paper. My capital stabilizes your firm. In exchange, I get oversight and a seat on the board. To show you I'm serious about reconciliation, look at Clause 4. Leonard didn't even pretend to read the first 3 pages. He flipped through the legal jargon with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his breath hitching when he reached the middle of the document. There, highlighted in a clean, bold box, was the figure. $2 million. Immediate signing bonus/operational stipend. $2 million, he whispered, the words escaping like a prayer. He looked at Naomi, a jagged, triumphant grin breaking across his face. You see, I told you she was a mercer. She knows how to take care of the name. He didn't see the fine print beneath that number. He didn't see the affidavit of voluntary disclosure hidden in the appendix, or the clause stating that by accepting these funds, the signatory took sole legal and criminal responsibility for all prior financial discrepancies found within the estate's history. He didn't see the trap because he was too busy reaching for his gold fountain pen. This is exactly what we needed, Chloe, Naomi cooed, reaching out to touch my hand. I pulled back just enough to make her miss, masquerading the move as I reached for my drink. Leonard didn't hesitate. He scribbled his signature with a flourish, the ink wet and permanent on the page. He thought he was signing a lease on a new life. He didn't realize he had just signed a confession. He handed the folder back to me, his chest out, the man of the year, once again. To family, he said, raising his glass. To be honest, I replied, and I didn't look away when he drank. The champagne in Leonard's glass was still swirling when I closed the leather folder with a definitive heavy thud. The sound echoed across the deck, sharp as a gavel. Leonard was still wearing that predatory, satisfied grin, his fingers drumming against the teak table as if he were already spending the $2 million. You really should have read the appendix, Leonard, I said, my voice dropping the facade of corporate neutrality. It was cold now, a clinical edge honed by 7 years of silence. He blinked, his smile faltering but not yet fading. What are you talking about, Chloe? We just signed a partnership. It's a new start for the cross name. It's the end, I corrected. I flipped the folder back open to the signature page, pointing not at his name, but at the block of microscopic text he had ignored in his rush for the bonus. That wasn't a joint venture agreement. It's a voluntary disclosure and affidavit of liability addressed to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. By signing that and accepting the bonus, which by the way originated from a flagged offshore account I've been monitoring, audit trail-wise, you just confessed. The color didn't just drain from Leonard's face. It vanished, leaving him a sallow, translucent gray. Beside him, Naomi's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the deck. The sparkling wine ran into the grooves of the wood, looking exactly like the spilled scotch I used to scrub off the floors as a child. You set me up, Leonard stammered, his voice cracking. You're my daughter. You can't do this. You deleted your daughter 7 years ago, remember? I leaned forward, my shadow falling over him. You claimed me as a dependent on your tax returns for 3 years after you kicked me out. You used my name to open shell accounts. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a shield. Well, I'm not your shield anymore. I'm the whistleblower. That signing bonus triggered a digital alert the moment you put pen to paper. The authorities aren't just coming for the money, Leonard. They're coming for the man who thought he could erase people like they were bad entries in a ledger. Julian stood up, his face a mask of panicked entitlement, looking for an exit on a boat surrounded by miles of open water. There was nowhere to go. The golden child and his parents were finally exactly what they had made me. Isolated, exposed, and utterly alone. The heavy thrum of a helicopter approaching from the coastline signaled the end of the performance. I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs. I had already seen enough of my father's face to last a lifetime. At my signal, the yacht security team stepped forward. Tall, silent men who moved with a clinical precision that the Cross family couldn't bully. The visit is over, I said, my voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. I watched from the bridge deck as they were escorted down the gangway. Leonard was shouting, his face a frantic shade of purple as he pointed back at the ship, trying to reclaim a dignity that had been liquidated the moment he signed that paper. Naomi was weeping, though even now it looked practiced, her eyes darting around the marina to see who was watching her fall. Julian just looked small, a boy who had finally realized that being the golden child meant nothing when the gold was fake. As the tender carried them back to the pier where the authorities were waiting, I pulled my phone from my pocket. One by one I pulled up their contacts. Mother, father, Julian. I didn't hesitate. I deleted the numbers, the message threads, and the 7 years of saved photos I'd kept like digital scars. I didn't need the evidence of their cruelty anymore. I was no longer the girl they could Photoshop out of a life. Anchors aweigh, Captain, I radioed. The vibration of the massive engines hummed through the soles of my feet, a grounding rhythmic pulse. As the Aegis turned its bow toward the open sea, the shoreline of Antibes began to shrink into a jagged line of gray and green. For the first time in my life, the air didn't feel heavy with expectation or the rot of family secrets. It felt clean. I had spent my youth trying to be seen by people who were blind to everything but their own reflection. Now, as I sailed into the vast blue silence of the Mediterranean, I realized that being alone wasn't a punishment. It was the most expensive peace I had ever bought. If you've ever had to sink the ship to save your soul, type peace in the comments. I'm finally home. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.